The message on her phone was like a punch to the gut. Her son Anthony was in trouble. Again. She raced to his apartment, her heart a frantic drum in her chest. Reaching his door, she didn't bother with knocking. She pounded, the sound echoing in the hallway. "Anthony, open this door!" Her voice was raw with fear. Behind the closed door, silence met her pleas. It was the silence that scared her the most. A silence heavy with unspoken dread. She leaned against the door, her body trembling. Memories, unwelcome and sharp, flooded her mind. She saw Anthony as a little boy, his eyes bright with laughter. That same boy, now a stranger, lost in the throes of addiction. Her beautiful boy. Her heart ached with a pain that threatened to consume her. Each second that ticked by felt like an eternity. She pounded again, harder this time, her knuckles throbbing. "Anthony, please! Mama's here! Let me in!" The first time was a blur of sirens and hospital smells. Anthony, pale and lifeless, hooked up to machines. The doctor's words were a hammer blow, opioid overdose. She remembered the utter disbelief, the feeling of the world tilting on its axis. Then came the rehab stint, a carousel of hope and despair. Anthony making progress, then slipping back into the abyss. The guilt was a heavy cloak she couldn't shed. Had she missed the signs? Had she failed him as a mother? The second overdose was a cruel reminder that addiction was a monster that never truly slept. This time she found him in his room, a needle on the floor. The memory was a raw wound, the image seared into her brain. Now, standing outside his door, she was drowning in a sea of fear and helplessness. The past was a haunting echo, amplifying the terror that gripped her heart. Despite the fear that threatened to paralyze her, a fierce determination surged through her veins. She wouldn't lose him. She couldn't. Anthony was her son, her flesh and blood, and she would fight for him with every fiber of her being. Looking around, she realized the hallway was empty. Not a sound from the other apartments. The silence seemed to mock her desperation. She needed help. Someone to break down the door, someone to share the burden of her fear. Taking a deep breath, she pounded on the door once more. "Anthony, I'm not leaving! If you don't open this door, I'm calling for help." Her voice, though laced with panic, held a thread of steely resolve. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let the monster win. She was his mother, and she would fight for him, even if it meant battling his demons alongside him. A door creaked open down the hallway, and a head cautiously emerged. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who always smelled faintly of mothballs, peered out. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, the frantic mother, the pounding on the door, the air thick with unspoken dread. "Is everything all right, dear?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice a hesitant whisper. Before she could answer, another door opened. Mr. Jones, a burly man who kept to himself, stepped out. He glanced at the door, then at her, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension on his face. Soon, other residents began to emerge from their apartments, drawn by the commotion. Whispers like nervous birds flitted through the hallway. She saw a mix of emotions on their faces: concern, fear, even annoyance. "He's my son," she choked out, her voice breaking. He needs help." A wave of understanding seemed to wash over the small crowd. The whispers died down, replaced by a palpable tension. The initial reluctance gave way to a shared sense of urgency. Mr. Jones, his face grim, stepped forward. "Let me try," he said, his voice gruff but kind. He moved towards the door, his large frame filling the doorway. He pounded on the door with a force that reverberated through the hallway. "Anthony, it's Mr. Jones, open up!" The others, emboldened by Mr. Jones's actions, added their voices to the chorus. "Anthony, we're here to help. Please, son, let us in." The combined voices, filled with concern and a touch of desperation, seemed to finally penetrate the silence behind the door. A groan, low and pained, came from inside the apartment. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered neighbors. Hope flickered in her chest, fragile but real. He was alive. Mr. Jones, sensing her relief, gave her a reassuring nod. He threw his weight against the door again, and this time, with a splintering crack, it gave way. The sight that greeted them sent a wave of nausea through her. Anthony lay slumped on the floor, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow. The room was in disarray, a testament to his inner turmoil. Without hesitation, she rushed to his side, dropping to her knees beside him. She checked for a pulse, her fingers trembling as they found the faint thrumming beneath his skin. He was alive, but barely. Someone had called 911, and the wail of approaching sirens filled the air. The sound, usually a harbinger of chaos and fear, brought a strange sense of relief. Help was coming. Section 7. Controlled Chaos. The arrival of the paramedics was like a choreographed dance of controlled chaos. They moved with swift efficiency, their voices calm and authoritative as they assessed the situation. She watched as they gently lifted Anthony onto a stretcher, their movements practiced and precise. A young paramedic, his face etched with concern, met her eyes. "We're taking him to Mercy Hospital. You can follow us in your car." She nodded numbly, her mind struggling to keep up with the rapid turn of events. It was as if she were caught in a whirlwind, powerless to do anything but watch as it swept her along. As they wheeled Anthony out of the apartment, she caught a glimpse of the faces of her neighbors, their expressions a mixture of concern and relief. They had come together in those terrifying moments, their initial apprehension replaced by a shared humanity. Section 8. Into the Abyss. The drive to the hospital was a blur. She followed the ambulance, its lights painting the night sky with streaks of red and blue. The rhythmic whoosh of the sirens seemed to mirror the frantic beating of her heart. All she could see was Anthony's face, pale and still, as they carried him out of his apartment. The memory of his labored breathing, the way his chest rose and fell with such effort, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, praying with every fiber of her being that they wouldn't be too late, that he would be okay, that this wasn't the end. The hospital loomed ahead, its brightly lit windows a beacon in the darkness. As she pulled into the parking lot, she felt a sense of dread wash over her. Hospitals held too many memories, too many echoes of past pain. Section 9. ER. Reflections. The emergency room was a cacophony of sound and movement. Doctors and nurses rushed about, their voices a low hum against the beeping of machines. The air was thick with antiseptic, and a palpable sense of urgency. She sat numbly in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The events of the past few hours played over and over in her mind, a cruel and relentless loop. The message on her phone, the frantic drive to his apartment, the fear that had gripped her heart when she realized the gravity of the situation. As she waited for news of her son, she couldn't help but reflect on the path that had led them to this point. The early signs she had missed, the conversations she wished she had had. The guilt was a heavy weight threatening to drag her under. Section 10. A Mother's Vigil. Hours crawled by, each one an eternity. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum with a cruel indifference to her plight. The waiting room was sparsely populated, the other occupants lost in their own worlds of worry and fear. A doctor, his face etched with fatigue, finally emerged from the double doors that led to the treatment area. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. "Mrs.?" the doctor began, his voice gentle. "Miller," she breathed, her eyes searching his face for any clue as to her son's fate. He offered a tired smile. "Your son is a fighter. He's stable for now. He's going to be okay." Relief washed over her, so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. He was alive. He was going to be okay. The words were a balm to her soul, easing the fear that had been a constant companion for what felt like an eternity. As she followed the doctor to see Anthony, she realized that this was just the beginning of a long and arduous journey. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself a small measure of hope. He was alive, and that was all that mattered.